There are moments when you can sense when your life will take a turn. A seemingly insignificant choice or action can have a profound and irreversible impact on your life. Leaving the house that afternoon to return Wayne's food processor, I had a sneaking suspicion this wasn't your run-of-the-mill errand. While Gail was out on her 5th business trip, I was 45. Despite my best efforts throughout the years, this absence seemed different. He knew I would have to return the processor on my own, so he left it with me. Wayne let me borrow it. Just like that, he had told you may return it. Compared to Gail, I found everything to be complicated. I paused to collect myself before pounding on Wayne's door. My pulse was pounding. I don't know what pulled me to Wayne. His cool, collected attitude or the fact that I felt lost in my marriage's routine. Whatever it was, I had the impression that beyond that door lay a whole other world. I didn't give it much thought, but little did I realize that something was about to happen that would rock my marriage and my whole identity. I waited a few seconds before knocking on the door. There was complete silence indoors. The second time I knocked, I was more forceful. The same old story. The door was slightly ajar, which I then observed. I felt a surge of anxiety. Wayne usually walked on eggshells. It was very unusual for him to leave his door open. There has to be a problem. Perhaps something had gone wrong, like he had fallen. Stay up to date with all the latest news like this by subscribing to this channel and enabling alerts. Believe me when I say that Amy's narrative takes a bittersweet turn. Stay to the very end if you can. I yelled out to Wayne as I entered the room. There is no response. A strange and crushing hush weighed down on me. I continued forth. Inside, the air was warm and slightly scented with soap. I wasn't sure, but I thought he could be in the bathroom showering. "How are you doing, Wayne?" A little quiver crept into my voice. The same old story. My pulse started to quicken. What if the situation had been different? What if he couldn't do it alone? I strode over to where the restroom was located. There was complete quiet save for the trickle of water. There was a small gap in the bathroom door. Worry rose within me. Did he really pass away? Perhaps that was his reason for remaining silent. For an instant I was on the fence because my more reasonable self was yelling at me to back out, get out of here. Except that I was unable to. The shame of not helping would be too much for me to bear if something had gone wrong and I hadn't been involved. I opened the door softly, taking a deep breath. His appearance came next. Unclothed, Wayne stood in the shower. The steam in the room was mixed with the water that poured over his body. Our gazes met for an instant. I felt a mix of shock and humiliation, yet I couldn't bring myself to turn away or go. As time went on, Wayne's demeanor went from astonished to relaxed. "Is this Amy?" His voice betrayed a mix of astonishment and an odd sort of relief as he inquired. It was merely a pause in my throat choked on the words. I felt entirely exposed and vulnerable all of a sudden. Why am I even here? Why did I allow this to transpire? When you failed to respond, the door remained ajar. I was so embarrassed that my voice was barely heard as I murmured, but I was finally worried. After a moment of reflection, Wayne removed himself from the shower, dried his hair, and turned off the water. My heart was thumping so loudly that it drowned out the sound of the water when it ceased to flow. "I'm fine," he assured me, fixing his gaze squarely on mine. I suppose at this moment, none of us has a clear idea of what to do. After a brief pause, Wayne's expression of surprise swiftly faded. With that composed look on his face, water continued to stream down his shoulders as he met my eyes. It seemed as if he was attempting to defuse the uncomfortable situation by appearing unconcerned. He leisurely reached for a towel that was dangling from a neighboring rack. Even though he was smiling somewhat, he admitted that he had scared you a little. His motion was so assured as he encircled the towel around his waist that I was momentarily perplexed. "When you failed to respond, the door remained ajar." My voice was slightly quivering as I repeated. Despite my beating heart, I found some strange solace in Wayne's composed manner. He stated that the front door locks had broken as he fastened the towel around his waist. "Seeing how concerned you were startled me because I was planning to contact someone to fix it after I dried off in the shower. Also, I have to confess that it had a pleasant effect on me." My cheeks burned with shame as my face flushed. It was hard for me to look away. His self-assured stance and the water falling off his skin held my undivided attention. "I'm sorry," I managed to utter, bringing my head. Down. I merely suspected that something may have transpired. Wayne cautiously edged closer, taking care not to go too close. He maintained an appropriate distance so as not to aggravate the situation. He spoke in a soothing, comforting voice. Amy, I really appreciate you being a wonderful neighbor. It has been quite a while since I last felt someone concerned about my well-being. My jaw clenched. I was at a loss for words. It was far more than I had anticipated for Wayne to have such a warm and welcoming presence. His genuine expression soothed me in an odd way, but I couldn't shake the unease he instilled in me. Well, I actually came to drop off the food processor, I responded, clutching the box with all my might. I didn't know what to do or where to start. I felt completely lost. Wayne grinned slightly. He playfully taunted about the food processor, which was obviously very important to him. However, by leaving you standing like way, I feel like I'm violating neighborly protocol. Shall we brew a pot of coffee? Well, assuming you're not rushing, that is. I was at a loss for words. I considered sticking around for coffee for a brief while, but I also wanted to leave that place as soon as possible. My heart was racing, and the memory of him in the shower lingered in my thoughts. When I finally mustered up the courage to say no, I forced a grin. Now is probably a good time for me to go. Hello, Gail. Soon Gail will return. Ahead of that time, I have several tasks to complete. Wayne gave a little nod, as if he understood. Sure thing. The door, though, is not an issue. I will resolve this issue today. Looking at me, he lowered his voice to a lower register for an instant. Having neighbors like you is a blessing. Some strange emotion that I couldn't put my finger on was aroused by his comments. With a swift nod, I positioned the food processor next to the door and turned to depart. Still, I could feel Wayne's watchful gaze following me as I made my exit. A mental whirlwind ensued as I made my way home. Witnessing Wayne in that state, with his confidence and charm. For what reason had it started my heart racing? What could possibly have caused such a profound reaction in me from such a casual meeting? Upon returning home, the thought continued to occupy my thoughts. Watching Wayne in the shower, he seemed so at ease and assured. I attempted to get rid of the mental image, but it wouldn't budge. The excitement I had when I declined his offer of coffee was the most bothersome thing, though. I reacted more like an uncomfortable adolescent than a mature woman. Am I even doing this? As I paced aimlessly about the kitchen, I mumbled to myself. Lost in my own thoughts, that's how I passed the night. His pleasant grin, words, and stare continued to loop in my mind despite my best efforts to ignore them. I attempted to run my errands first thing in the morning the following day, but I was completely distracted. It was as if someone or something was prodding me to take action. I had abandoned Wayne. I had to make amends because I had been impolite by declining the coffee. As the sun began to drop in the afternoon, I caught a glimpse of Wayne outside the window. He seemed completely absorbed in his thoughts as he stood by his car, cleaning it down. As always, he moved with composure and purpose. For a moment, I was engrossed in watching him and forgot how much time had passed. After calming myself with a long breath, I resolved to use this opportunity to put things right. I got to my feet, opened the door and stepped out into the yard. I yelled out to Wayne. With his customary radiant smile spreading across his face, he raised his eyes to meet mine. How are things going, Amy? With a lowering of the fabric, he spoke. I froze up for a second, unsure of what to say. After that, I composed myself and forced a grin. That day, I declined your offer of coffee. Actually, I was quite busy, but I certainly did not intend to abandon you. I apologize for it. Still wearing a pleasant grin, Wayne tilted his head ever so slightly. Very little to worry about, Amy. Okay, I see. This time I was more certain. I will make amends to you. You have worked tirelessly, and now the sun is going to set. Have a cup of coffee on us. A new cake was also created by me. In my opinion, it's fantastic. For an instant, Wayne paused. However, he maintained his expression. Saying it with a gentle smile, he thought it sounded magnificent. I would prefer not to bother you, though. It's really unnecessary. Immediate response. Sure, I'd be happy to help. I felt a strange joy at seeing the expression on Wayne's face at that moment. The cake and coffee were already in the oven. However, the friendly chat was perhaps what I was most anticipating. Perhaps I felt a bit less lonely simply because he was there. However, my internal unease intensified as I stood there in those apparently ordinary moments, with the house appearing quite regular. The assumption was that since Gail was abroad, everything was going to be all right and business as usual. But I found it to be more complex than that. Even though I'm at home in the quiet, my mind is racing and my eyes are closed, I still can't relax. Never mind Wayne. He was merely a neighbor. How come I felt this way then? I didn't know how profound an impact it would have on me until yesterday, when I caught a glimpse of him in the shower. For a second or two. However, I felt a stirring within me as a result of the intensity of that moment. Everything about him, his self-assured posture, the water trickling from his hair, and his gaze was captivating. Are actual eyes capable of storing so much information? All of a sudden everything shifted. Neither Wayne nor I knew one other on a personal level, and I knew it to be true. We both felt an unsaid pull, yet we never spoke a word. After that, the coffee and the offbeat discussion followed. We seemed to have known each other for a long time. Because our bond was so effortless, it was easy to forget that we were essentially complete strangers to each other. We were completely at ease with one another. It was like we'd run into each other again after our paths had crossed long ago. Despite my best efforts, I could not stop us from drawing nearer. I was a wife at the time. My life with Gail was complete. Married life had long since ended for Wayne. Regardless of my perspective, this was a completely novel experience for me. The intense attraction between us was making it difficult for me to breathe due to the mounting guilt I was experiencing. After a quick drink of his coffee, Wayne continued to speak while staring at me. Everything in your life, Amy. We can't always anticipate how things will turn out. Like now, anything can change in the blink of an eye. He suggested that, occasionally, we should delve a bit farther into the matter to discover the true desires of our soul. His seemingly innocuous remark struck me square in the gut. I clung to every word he said because his voice was soothing yet intensely perplexing. Out of nowhere, his voice dominated my senses and rendered all other sounds irrelevant. I dipped my head ever so little, my gaze fixed on his. The distance between us was rapidly narrowing, but it was still considerable. I felt a burning ignite inside me as his gentle stare pierced through me. For an instant, there was stillness as our gazes locked. My mind was completely empty. Wayne was the only one who could be seen. I was captivated. As I struggled to collect my thoughts as my heart raced, I felt an overwhelming want to lean toward him. I moved forward a little, then a little more. My entire being seemed to be submerged in him as my gaze remained fixed on him. There was not the slightest pause in our progress. We merely exchanged glances. The attraction between us intensified until it subtly burst. Suddenly, Wayne reached out and stroked my face with his gentle fingers. At this one moment, nothing else mattered. No sturm, no ama, no dutias. At this very second, we were completely alone with one another. For an instant we just stood there, staring at one another, and suddenly things changed. I bent down toward his mouth and tilted my head ever so slightly. Not a single second was wasted. I kissed him, letting go of all the intense emotions, the guilt and the passion. I realized how profound this moment was as we drew nearer. My mind was completely absorbed by the enchantment of the moment. That kiss belonged to us more than anything else. There, at a remote location accessible only by the two of us, it was ours. Holding on to each other all night long, we felt as if we were the only ones in the world. The passage of time, the drawing of our bodies closer, and the intensification of our connection were all things I failed to perceive. It met all my requirements. I felt more at ease in Wayne's company. Although being in his company brought me a sense of calm, it also caused a deep emotional scar. It wasn't only the night. We were each other's burdens as well. It was all really complicated. Upon waking up in the morning, I felt the comforting embrace of Wayne's embrace. A tranquil awakening it was. Everything seemed to be precisely where it ought to be, regardless of how disorganized it was at the time. I could make out Wayne's soothing words as I slowly opened my eyes. "Are you all right? Is that so?" he inquired. His captivating stare with those intense eyes fixed on me washed over me like a tsunami. It was as if I were dreaming. Such was the intensity of the moment and the filling of my inner emptiness. "I believe I'm all right. I muttered as I cocked my head to one side. There was still a void inside of me, but being in Wayne's soothing company helped ease my burden. For a while, we did nothing more than sit quietly and enjoy being in each other's company. Wayne then talked more slowly. This was never meant to happen, Amy. However, I had the impression that something was correct when we were chatting and being together. I can't deny that we messed up. This must be immediately ended. The calm he exuded from his experience and the empathy in his speech helped calm my racing thoughts. My pulse rate increased as I listened. Yeah, I told you so, Wayne. Yeah, this was a bad idea. Gail is great. Together we have built our lives. I don't know how much I felt being here with you right now, but it will never happen again. This is too much for me. Wayne slowly nodded, his countenance a mix of seriousness and gentleness. This is too far, Amy. We should have stopped here. Yet you are loved by me. Yes, I do. The next step is to recognize when to back off. I could tell it was finished by the soft yet forceful tone of his voice. Leaving behind the comfort and intimacy was incredibly challenging. Finally, Wayne leaned in for another kiss. However, a lack of enthusiasm drove it this time. It seemed like farewell. There was a promise in that kiss, and we were both aware of it. I will now avoid you, Amy. But I love you, he assured her. I realized then that our relationship had come to an end. As he stepped aside, Wayne faded into thin air. I couldn't tear my gaze away from the deserted walkway where he had been. It seemed as if a chapter had closed and a chapter had been abandoned. My feelings of complex love and longing for him, nevertheless, would never go away. Following some time, Gail returned. After a while, things got back to normal. To be sure, I was lacking something on the inside. This void appeared inside of me after Wayne departed. My life with Gail was complete. My allegiance to him could not waver. I felt a slash run through me when Wayne wasn't around. The memory of that night in the shower and Wayne's exposed body keeps coming back to me. Everything changed and got so strong under the water. I can still feel it. Nothing seemed to precede or follow it because of how quickly it passed. It all began with a kiss, and then we were holding hands. It felt like we'd known one another for years by the time it was over. Being with Wayne brought me calm. I felt like the world had been lifted off my shoulders as we talked to him. That friendliness, those intense stares, and the conviction in his voice. Nothing else seemed to exist beyond those exact moments. It was all very real. At this point, though, it seems like a dream. Everything seemed to come to a halt when Wayne made the decision to leave. I said, "Yeah, you're right, it won't happen again," in response to his confession that he loved me, but only because he was separating himself from me. However, the thought of it coming to a close weighed heavily on me. That night, I had a flood of emotions that I was unable to articulate. Hello, Gail. Gail never changed. His absence left the house feeling deserted. His indifference, the stillness. This was the most I'd felt in a long time, to be honest. Something about being around Gail made me feel uneasy. On the other hand, it provided me with zero value. I found myself increasingly isolated as the emptiness within me deepened. Differences abound between Gail and me. Suddenly, it seemed like we were completely alienated from one another. The soothing warmth of Wayne's presence continued to seep into my mind after those peaceful days, while Gail's apathy festered like a wound. Now that Wayne isn't here, though, how am I feeling? I don't see anything. Something missing. An immense void. And this is my understanding. The familiarity of this home and the life I lead with Gail no longer brings me peace. I am reminded of how precious Wayne's affection and proximity were by his lack of interest. Because of this, I feel like I'm floating aimlessly. It's all pretty chaotic and unclear. Along with Gail's apathy, the void that Wayne's departure has created within me is far larger. Two guys. Two distinct realities. To be honest, I have no idea which one I like. I adore one. However, one thing is certain. I feel like this void will not be filled by either Wayne's leaving or Gail's disregard. And now I have to deal with all these complicated feelings. I don't know what to do with my life after Wayne's influence and Gail's seeming lack of interest have left me bewildered. One side we have love. Loneliness is present on the other side. Where do I stand? I'm merely existing, clinging to the life I've crafted, contemplating the serenity that Wayne bestowed upon me. Bewildered, not knowing what to do. Having the knowledge to know if this is the better choice. The subject at hand. This bewilderment. It's wearing me down. I can tell this narrative had a profound effect on you because you've come this far. Believe me when I say that there is a plethora of additional information that you will not want to miss. Please consider subscribing, enabling notifications, and commenting with your thoughts. I can't wait to hear your side of the argument. I am incredibly grateful for your support.